Hi everyone. I'm Patrick Gage Kelley, a privacy, security, and anti-abuse researcher at Google. And a person in my line of work hears all the time that privacy is dead. You too have probably heard privacy is dead, or at least you've heard this question, is privacy dead? In mainstream publications and advice from CEOs, from venture funders, even in the academic press. But you know it isn't. Every time you tell someone a secret, particularly if you expect them not to repeat it or use it in a way that might embarrass you, every time you write something down in a diary or a journal which you know a family member or a partner could read, every time you have a thought inside your own mind and then catch yourself and say, don't think that. These are moments of privacy as trust or secrecy or freedom, and we all have them. These moments are part of being human, and the protection of these moments where we express privacy is part of what allows us to flourish. And yet, we hear too often about how privacy is dead or dying, enough that an idea I don't give credence to is something that we're going to spend today working to understand. To explore what it would mean for privacy to actually be dead, and deconstruct this, specifically in a quantitative way, using data from over 90,000 respondents that we at Google have been working to understand over the last few years. Specifically, we've been working with a series of public opinion polling firms, including GfK, Ipsos, and most recently Gallup. We did this to get the highest gold standard sets of responses we could from people around the world. We began in 2015 with just a few countries, and we now have responses from 29 countries on 6 continents, and are beginning to see often very stable trends year over year. Our survey instrument, that is, the specific questions we ask our participants, has also evolved over time, with a core of 60 items about privacy and technology. These questions range from far-reaching opinions to their current attitudes and to self-reported behaviors on their engagement with specific privacy technologies. For example, let's start with a question that we asked our respondents. I want you to think to yourself and answer this. To think about the amount of privacy you'll have 10 years from now, in 2031. Will it be more, less, or the same amount of privacy that you have today? From the data we have, we think that 49% of people expect to have more privacy in 10 years, 18% expect about the same, and 33% expect less privacy than they have today. That's half of the population expecting more privacy, about 1 in 5 expecting the same, and just a third expecting less, maybe the third that might think privacy is dead. Now, assuming you all, the attendees of Enigma, are similar to the populations across the couple of dozen countries we studied, you might have thought similar responses, though we'll come back to why the Enigma audience might be a little bit different a little bit later. Now, these results might seem optimistic. It might be hope that privacy regulation can provide more data protection. It might be hope that new technologies will keep our information safe from unwanted and inappropriate data use. It might just be pure optimism. Even if you considered that privacy could be more protected in some ways, but at greater risk in others, even if you tried to balance these concerns, many of our participants, data that implies millions or billions of people around the world, are choosing to believe that they will have a future with privacy. This, along with much of the rest of our data, confirms that people haven't yet given up on privacy. So that's our first point today, that people are optimistic about the privacy they will have in 10 years. And for the rest of today's talk, I'd like to take us on a journey through 5 more interesting findings in our data. The second is that people just straight up say privacy is important. While asking people to forecast how much privacy they expect to have in a decade is interesting and a fun thought experiment, it's not the most direct measure of how people feel about privacy today. So our first measure here is doing just that. When we asked participants directly, saying, how important is the following to you? People told us that privacy is important to them. Very important, actually. We asked our respondents this question on a 5-point Likert scale. That means our participants had 5 options. In this case, extremely important, very important, moderately important, slightly important, or not at all important. Those last two, slightly and not at all important, are those 2 thin gray lines on the right side of the bar graph, totaling just about 3% of our global respondents. What this means is almost no one thinks privacy isn't important to them. And across the last 6 years, we regularly see that these top 2 categories, very and extremely important, are the choices an overwhelming majority select. That's about 9 in 10 of our respondents, near universal support, the type of support across countries, demographics, and time that we see for very few of our measures. Simply, when we ask people if privacy is important, they say, it is. It's very important. But of course, they're just telling us that they believe it's important. This brings us into our first set of sort of methodological notes about how we do this large survey work. And these results come with all the caveats that are contained in doing survey work. That means the data we're covering today is self-reported, just like how people tell us how privacy is important to them. To execute these global surveys means that we wrote the questions, we provided the answers, and people had to answer the questions within the bounds of the responses we offered them. They couldn't tell us that privacy was important in some different or nuanced way. They had to answer it on our scale. Similarly, there was no way to specify that if you think you will have privacy more in some ways in 10 years and less in others, you can't tell us that. Do you average it and say it will be the same? Do you weigh these differently? We aren't giving participants a way to tell us more. While we built our survey instrument iteratively over multiple years and began with a selection of items from Pew, Eurobarometer, Gallup, Ipsos, and other public opinion polling tools, no survey question is perfect in terms of how respondents will read, understand, and answer it, or how stable it is over time. Additionally, we've asked our participants to fill out a 20-minute survey of privacy attitudes. That may have been more time than they normally spend thinking about privacy in the course of a month. This may have framed their answers to questions as they worked their way through the survey. But even with these caveats in mind, we think these results really show how people are engaging with privacy. Our third highlight today is that people have a range of negative experiences online. Thinking back to our last 2 questions, the future or the importance of privacy, these can feel very abstract, very opinion-based. But we've also included items that attempt to measure people's lived experiences and the impacts of privacy directly on people's lives. One type of impact that privacy, or most often a lack or compromise of privacy, can have are negative experiences. We've asked our participants if they've experienced a wide variety of negative experiences while online, with 7 in 10 respondents across all of the countries we surveyed telling us they'd experienced viruses, malware, or some other form of hacking, that they'd been exposed to unwanted explicit content, that they'd been the target of a scam, phishing, or some other form of identity theft, and more. On this chart, we're showing a selection of the negative experiences that people globally have faced. And while some are relatively infrequent, I don't want to minimize the potentially severe impacts that some of these events can have. While not all of these may seem directly related to privacy in the ways we think about it within this community, our participants often think of these events and other events online in relationship with how they consider the use of their data and their ideas of safety and privacy. Also, the range and forms of the negative experiences change based on the country, as well as demographics, particularly the participant's gender. But again, I just want to emphasize that 7 in 10 of our respondents globally have directly and personally felt how their privacy and safety have been threatened online. Now, I just mentioned that the negative experiences that people have online change based on the country. And we see that difference on several metrics. I've glossed over a lot of the details here, and while I'm going to keep doing that to keep this talk at a very high level, I've shown various global summaries, and the story isn't that simple. Even the method of taking a global average or reporting a single global metric is not straightforward. We can't take this data and encapsulate it down into a single number that represents how people feel about privacy around the entire world. With privacy, as with most socio-technical problems, this is a complex and nuanced space. And I don't want you to leave this talk believing that every person or that every group or community think of privacy similarly. We see some very big divides between some countries and on certain metrics in some questions. And so now we're going to revisit a few of the questions we've already explored today to see how much some of these regions differ. Thinking back to how our global summary of people thinking about privacy in the next 10 years, this first, the top bar here, is the same data I showed earlier, where again, about half of our respondents globally think there will be more privacy in 10 years. When we separate this out by country, though, you can see that the US, Ireland, and France have far fewer people responding that they think they will have more privacy in the next 10 years. You can also see a country like Thailand, which matches the global totals almost exactly, and countries like Nigeria and China, where a greater percentage of people expect to have more privacy in the next 10 years. Here, we just see a lot more optimism for privacy. And as we continue through this tour of insights, we will continue to see this particular divergence, with a lot of optimism for privacy and for technology in countries that are still what we think of as the developing world. In the fixed effect size analysis we conducted, we found country-level differences matter more than any demographics, including age, gender, urbanicity, and more. So again, the country-level and regional differences really do have an impact on the results that we're looking at today. However, there are questions where this isn't true as well. And so again, we cannot just oversimplify this to where certain countries will always behave in tandem or in unison. We also have questions like the importance of privacy, where we see some differences here between what percentage of our participants and respondents reported privacy being very important or extremely important, but there really aren't sharp divides here. And importantly, there's no country in our data set where we see 20% or even 10% of our respondents saying privacy isn't important. Those gray bars never get outside of our margin of error. But this brings us back into our second methodological break. Although I just showed a couple of graphs where I was just putting bar charts with countries and you could make easy visual comparisons, I want us to be really careful about making direct between country comparisons. Apart from the general concerns of comparing different communities, cultures, and societies, there are two specific limitations that make country comparisons a challenge. First, we wrote all of the items in English originally, and while we worked with local teams and experts to maintain very high levels of translation accuracy, concepts and languages won't always directly map. Our respondents are answering different questions. Secondly, the panels are also different. That is, the ways we get participants to take the survey and what we expect those participants to be representative of. For example, in Nigeria, which we looked at earlier as being one of the most optimistic places about privacy, our sample is most representative of the online population, almost entirely consolidated in urban areas, often younger than our global averages. We're looking at a different population there. Similarly, in India and China, our sample is specifically recruited to cover a mix based on a preset list of Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities. These are both quite different ways of recruiting participants than, for example, a country like the US, where we have almost true national representation, or in Europe, where we have really broad representation in our panels. And that broad representation allows us to do additional weighting. For example, we can weight on some of the demographic categories that we know very well at a national level and from our survey respondents. We take this work very seriously, but myself and the core researchers on this project are coming from a Western viewpoint. We are all currently based in the United States, and while we worked with colleagues in other countries, survey experts, translators, and local teams, we cannot fully separate out that gaze from this work. Okay, now while I'd be happy to talk about our methodological choices here all day and the trade-offs behind them, follow up with me after because I want to get back to the last two insights from our data. So, for the fifth feature, I want to tell a story about how our participants have strong opinions about data use. Here we asked our participants a series of 3 questions. All 3 of these questions are about when governments and law enforcement should have access to people's data. The first was if they should have access to examine specific data related to a specific investigation. We might think of this as a warrant or a very focused data request. And globally, we saw a split, with about 6 in 10 respondents saying yes, and 4 in 10 saying no, that this type of access shouldn't be allowed. We also asked about monitoring specific individuals suspected of wrongdoing. And again, we see a very similar split, with about 6 in 10 saying yes, this type of data access can be acceptable, even it's a little higher here. And so you might start to think, okay, well, about 60% of people think governments and law enforcement should have access to data, and the other 40% of participants think that they should have none of it. But this actually isn't what we see. We asked one more item here. If monitoring all individuals, including those not suspected of wrongdoing, was acceptable. And here we see that acceptability drops sharply, down to about 1 in 6 globally. Now, I don't bring this up to focus on the questions of government data use, but rather to show that participants and the people who are responding to our surveys are savvy enough to understand some uses of data are okay, and there are others they aren't comfortable with, even if it's the same types of data. This again flies directly in the face of the common argument that there's no hope for privacy. Privacy is dead because all the data is out there. What we see here is many people reporting they want some limits and constraints on how data should be able to be collected and used. The final insight I want to share today is an exploration into how our participants considered the possibility of being private in today's world. Unlike the result we showed very early on, where nearly everyone thought privacy was important, here we don't see that same broad agreement. We see a substantial number of people saying privacy is possible, and another group saying privacy isn't possible at all. We see a plurality of respondents, more than 1 in 3, right in the middle. This means the same people who told us earlier that privacy was very or extremely important to them think it's also not necessarily simple to achieve, and maybe some of them think it's impossible. I don't bring this up to end with the difficulty of achieving privacy on this pessimistic point, but rather as a challenge we must face. As we look back over everything we've seen today, we see that people aren't sure if privacy is possible online, but it's important. Even as many see privacy as challenging to achieve, as having limits in some cases and having gaps where attacks and harms can occur, we see across the world there are people concerned about the future of privacy, and many who remain optimistic. As we reflect back on this and all of the data that we have, I hope we've shown that people do not want or believe that privacy is dead. But I don't think the audience here at Enigma needed me to tell you that. When we think about privacy, we need to think about both the individual moments, these privacy decisions, data accesses, and challenging events that actually impact people's lives, but also their overall attitudes and sentiments. And we've seen that these will be interpreted differently by people and groups around the world, and also that people are able to consider and opine and are willing to engage with the subtleties of privacy. To close, I believe it's our role not only to study privacy views, but to protect people's privacy. And to do this, I believe we need to invest in 3 areas. 1, as a researcher, I'm convinced we need more deep foundational research into both specific privacy moments, the decisions people make and how they navigate these moments, but also research that respects and seeks to understand the cultural and social ways privacy manifests for different communities, particularly those that differ from our own, often Western, white, or Silicon Valley-focused conceptions of privacy and data. We hope this talk and this data helps to motivate more research in this vein. Second, we need to invest in protections and solutions, whether technological, regulatory, or simply by making our existing systems more usable and accessible, to give people control in some cases, but even more importantly, to help them feel there are some systems in this world that are designed to make the privacy they desire feel possible. And finally, we need to shift the narrative. Privacy may be struggling, but we must maintain some hope. Some who claim privacy will die are saying this to make a claim of inevitability because they want to own a future where privacy is gone and they can use data however they see fit. This isn't the only way, and we must provide alternate, more optimistic visions of how privacy-protective futures can be built. Thank you all so much, and I'm happy to take questions.